All right, so I just wanted to add a little bit more about science, statistical inference, things like that that weren't covered in the module, but are still really important for doing neuroscience and science in general, and also just for like navigating the world. Yeah, okay. So I guess hitting that the first time just makes it loop into. Yeah, okay. So experience is a big thing that cuts into systematic scientific observation. So they don't have to be opposites, but it usually happens that they are. People like to rely more on experience and expertise than they do on well controlled systematic studies. I think the reason for this is it's easier to tell a story if you talk about your experience or someone is talking about their experience. So they can say, like, oh, like I do this job, and this one time this guy came in, and this happened, and this was the result, and isn't that crazy? And so what we can learn from this is this one crazy thing, and if it happened to me, and I've heard other people say it, geez, it must be the thing. That's not always true. I mean, because we're not systematically observing these things. It doesn't necessarily mean that person's wrong. Okay, let me give you an example. All right. So a good example is, let's say someone is out at night, telling you a story. They're like, "Yeah, I was out at night, and I saw this thing. Like I looked up in the sky and I saw this thing. It was like a crazy thing that I saw, and like it moved in a way that like, you know, a plane doesn't move, and it was just so bizarre." And I'm not the only person that's seen something like this. And they can show you like a YouTube video where somebody else is talking about seeing strange things. Or they can even sometimes have another friend who's seen something like this. And that's intriguing. But when you do systematic observation, there's a few things that happen. So, first of all, people are not systematically observing the night sky. People tend not to look up. We just don't. We don't do that. We don't look up. I recently started wearing glasses. So if you've had any other classes with me, you know that like some of the videos, I don't have my glasses on, and that's actually true of like even still current videos. Like I'll take my glasses off because there's too much glare, and then it just looks like I've got like shiny eyes. But I did not used to wear glasses at all. And I enjoy like looking at stars, so I'd go out and I'd look at the stars, and I'm like, oh yeah, I can see like the usual constellations, and aren't they great? And that's cool. And then I got glasses, and let me tell you, you can see so much better when you can actually see. So I started catching all these, like one of the first things that happened is I went out and I'm like, man, I can see the stars so much better. I can see constellations I didn't think I could see in the place I was. I thought there was too much light pollution. Turns out there's light pollution, and this guy has bad eyes. So that was cool. Like I have a lot more things that I can actually see. One of the second things that happened was I started seeing little things moving, and I'm like, what the hell is that? Is that a UFO? And so I'm like telling people, I'm like, look at that thing. See that thing moving there? That's not a plane. And then it just kept happening. And I'm like, okay, what? So obviously it's not UFOs. And the other thing is they don't zip around like people say UFOs do. It's satellites. You can see satellites from the ground. I never knew you could because I had bad eyes. I've had bad eyes for a long time. I've known it. It's just like wearing glasses isn't cool. So I'm like, well, I don't want to look like a nerd. But I guess now I do. And so like I'm just seeing satellites all the time. You can see satellites out. So you go outside at night, look up for 5 minutes, you will probably see at least one satellite. There's so many satellites out there. It's cool to see them. You can tell that they're satellites because they move in like a perfect line. There's no changing of speed. There's no blinking. There's no nothing. It's just like a pinpoint of light that shoots across the sky slowly. It's not like a shooting star. And then, of course, there's Starlink, which looks like a chain of lights flying in the sky. And so if you start systematically looking at the night sky, like I was doing, you may see that, like, oh, there's actually a lot of weird stuff in the sky that isn't weird when you know what it is. When you're systematically observing it, it's like, oh, there's things going on here. Another into the story is when the CIA declassified their flight paths for the U-2 spy plane, which was recently, in like the 2010s, I think. This was tests that were done in the 60s, 50s, and 60s. It actually turned out that the flight paths coincided with a lot of people reporting unexplained things in the sky. So the experience wasn't necessarily wrong, but the interpretation was wrong. There wasn't something crazy happening. They were seeing a plane that was there. People told them they were crazy. And it turns out they were just seeing a pretty normal plane. I mean, now, like, there's the U-2 spy plane isn't even all that crazy. So they were just seeing a spy plane. So experience and then expertise, like all these things are kind of flawed. Experience is a single data point. Single data points can vary all over the place, but the average doesn't. So if I say, oh, I took this, you take your temperature multiple times throughout the day. And you may get one that's super low. 97.1. I took mine this morning because I'm like getting well from a cold or something. 97.1 is super low relative to like the 98.6 that we should have. And then sometimes you're up at like 98.3 for me is kind of high. 98.8 is pretty high. If you take your temperature throughout the day, though, you'll see that single data points can vary. So if you only take your temperature once, you may be like, geez, my temperature is super low. Or my temperature is kind of high. I might be getting sick. If you take it multiple times and kind of take a running average of it, you'll see that and you're not sick, you'll see that there's like a nice average place where your temperature is. So single data points can vary. We expect single data points to vary a ton, but the average stays the same. Let me show you a little bit more about that. This is called a Galton board. It's named after Francis Galton. And he was a statistician who, can we get this to focus a little bit better? No. Is it just focused out here? Maybe I have to hold it out here. That sucks. Okay. So what this is there's a ton of little BBs in here. Each of these, let me turn it upside down so you can see them. Those are all, each of those, a little BB. Now, if you follow just one of these when I turn this over, it's going to end up in a completely different place every single time. One BB. And in fact, if you could see this a little bit better, there's one of them in here. Most of them are silver. One of them is brass. And you can follow that one brass BB wherever it goes. And it'll go crazy places. It's on the left. It's on the right. It's right in the middle. Super far over, not super far over. Because single observations will vary a ton, but the average doesn't vary much. And that's what this is showing us. So what's happening is we've got this reservoir of little BBs down here. They're going to ping pong around on all these pegs. They're jumping all over the place. But what happens is they create this nice, perfect normal distribution right here. So the average always ends up right there every time, even though single observations end up all over the place, literally all over the place. But the actual average comes out to be the same every time. This is true for a lot of things that we measure in science. It's true for the heights of people, the heights of all humans. You know that there's people like Shaq, and you know that there's people like Warwick Davis. Super tall people, super short people. And people of all different sizes in between. But the average comes out to be pretty close to the same no matter what group of people you grab, right? So if you grab people at random and you take the average height of the humans, the average is pretty close, even though each individual measurement can be quite different. It's true for everything. Height's a good example. This is true for bold signals, blood oxygen level dependent signals in the brain. When we do fMRI research, what we're measuring is BOLD, blood oxygen level dependent signals in the brain, which shows where blood flow is going. That's what we're measuring. And moment to moment, that'll change. Even one reading to one reading, it's going to change. When we do an fMRI study, we run through 12 times to make sure that what's going on in the brain at that point. So if we have somebody read a passage that's emotionally salient to them versus one that is not emotionally salient, like a math passage or something like that, we don't just do it once and see what's going on in the brain, because there's variation. From single point to single point, there's variation. If you do it 12 times, read this emotionally salient passage about like a dog getting sick or something like that, and then read another one, all these emotionally salient passages, and then all this like crap about math. What ends up happening is, there's variation from time to time, but the average comes out in the middle, and we can see that there's places in the brain that are more active for emotionally salient passages than for math passages, and there's some places that are active for math passages that aren't for these emotionally salient passages. So we never rely on a single data point. That's not 100% true. There are case studies. There are small N designs. We try not to. When we use case studies and small N designs, it's because there's not an easy way to get a large group of data. It's better to have a large group of data because even though single data points change, averages don't. Averages tell us a better story. But let me continue on with this. Why is experience more subject to bias? Doesn't mean it's the only thing subject to bias. Experience can be biased, and so can systematic observation. Both of those can be biased. But experience is much more subject to bias. And there's a few reasons for this. One, it's especially falls prey to confirmation bias and salience bias. Confirmation bias is where you seek out data that's more in line with your existing opinions. So if you're going through life and you're experiencing things, you already have opinions, you already have preconceived notions. And so what you experience is filtered through that lens, or you may see 2 or 3 different things, but the one that sticks with you is the one that confirms your opinion already. So it's not even that people are like intentionally getting rid of this experience, the ones that don't fall in line with their opinions. It just sticks out more when it confirms their existing opinions. Well, with systematic observation, this doesn't happen. It's systematic observation. You can't ignore an entire group of data because of your preconceived opinions. That's just not a thing that happens. And then also the salience bias. Salience bias means that more emotionally volatile data or more sensorially volatile data or whatever, some sort of volatile data, gets more weight just because it's like more out there, right? So things in the news, the more terrible things in the news like really get people's attention. Because it gets people's attention, It seems like it happens more than it does, and that's actually not true. Really good example of this is if you actually look at data of how dangerous it is to live at this time, right now. It's one of the least dangerous times in history. Little more right now because there's a few wars going on. But a couple of years ago, before the stuff in Gaza, before the stuff in Ukraine, of course, there's always been conflicts. Always. There's always some conflicts. And if you go too far back, like the early 2000s, there was actually a very large war in Africa that a lot of people in the West don't know about. So there's always been some conflicts. But even now, when there's these conflicts going on, and even during the African Civil War, the modern time is one of the safest times to live. You go back a little bit further, like 1700s, it might seem like it's less dangerous. It's not true. It's actually far more dangerous. You go back to the 1500s, it's more dangerous than that. You go back to the medieval era, it's more dangerous than that. You go back to, I don't know, what the hell's going on in 900? Like Roman times, it's even more dangerous than that. You go back before that, it's super dangerous because people are getting eaten by saber-toothed tigers. So if you look at actual human death, actual human suffering, the likelihood that any given person is going to die violently, it's less now than any other time. But because we have the news, the nightly news and news on social media and all this stuff, it seems so dangerous. It seems like you're going to die as soon as you walk outside of your house. And it's just not true. It's just totally not true. Like it is the safest time to be alive right now. That's not saying there's not terrible things going on. There always is terrible things going on. I'm just saying statistically, it's safer now than it ever has been. And that's probably going to continue happening throughout time. The more civilized we become, the safer it is. But the more communication there is, the less safe it seems. Because you hear more stories that stand out emotionally. It's the salience bias. This is true. The reason I have senses on here, too, is because this is also true. I mean, think about bad smells. There is a road here in the Phoenix area. If you're from around here, Baseline. Baseline stinks all the time. It smells like an open anus all the time. And that stands out. I can't tell you that every road in, to me, I'm like, oh man, every road in Tempe smells like butt. It's not true. It's just Baseline. Baseline really stands out for smelling that bad. And I think me telling you this is actually probably showing the salience bias too, because I'm saying it's Baseline. Baseline runs across the entire Phoenix metro area. It probably doesn't stink the whole way. In fact, it probably only stinks in a small portion of Baseline. There's probably some sort of like area in the sewer underneath that's like got a problem, and it just happens to stink there. So in Buckeye and in East Mesa, it's probably fine. But what stands out to me is in Tempe, where it just stinks all the time. It's the salience bias. So to actually tell if this is true, what we should do is systematically test intersection by intersection, every intersection sniff, and mark down how many intersections along Baseline actually stink. And then we know if it actually is a stinky road. Or is it just 3 or 4 intersections that I happen to go to and go, why does it smell like that? That's the salience bias. Experience is going to fall prey to the salience bias. It just did. Me telling you about Baseline, just right there, showed you that the salience bias is the thing. And if we're talking about like medical experimentation or causes of things, I'm thinking about ASD vaccines kind of things, like, yeah, this person's experience, like it really seems like, oh man, there must be a correlation here. It's not true. If you actually systematically test these things, that's the real way to figure it out. People have done it, and of course there's no correlation. systematic observation is less likely to be biased. I cannot tell you that systematic observation is not biased. There's always the risk that something's biased. It's less biased. It doesn't fall prey to confirmation bias. It doesn't fall prey to salience bias. But the group of people that you choose to test may not be representative of the population. So that's one big point of bias with systematic observation. So nothing's perfect, but it's better. Systematic observation is a lot better. It's a lot less prey to bias. And then we have to talk about replication. Replication really is key. I mean, we can do one systematic study and we can say that there's less bias in this, so we can take it seriously. Yeah, that's true. But replication really is the best thing. So one study is great. 5 studies that show the same thing, even better. Even better. So every study could be flawed. And the statistics that we use to test these studies actually allow for false alarm errors. Like, we found a link. The statistics allow for the possibility that this is an error. It's called a type 1 error. If you've had statistics with me or anybody else, you know that there's a type 1 error. I actually don't know if I told you this in the beginning of the class, but I also teach statistics courses. I'm a statistician as well as a cognitive scientist. And it's an important thing to have the possibility for a false alarm error in your statistics. It's related to the p-value. We'll talk about that in a second. And every finding could be a spurious finding. Spurious means it looks like it's there and it's not. Every finding could be spurious. It's true. It's just a true thing. When we say that there's 95, when we set our p-value to 5%, to say that, if it's less than 5%, we're going to say that this is statistically significant. That means that we are accepting that 1 in 20 findings are potentially spurious findings. Like, we say that we found a link to something or a correlation between something. And it's not true 1 in 20 times. If you set your criteria for p-value at less than 1%, well, that's a little different. Then you're 99 times out of 100. Your results are not likely to be spurious. They could be. And then 1 time out of 99, at 1 time out of 100, you expect those results to be spurious. But how do we take care of this? Well, replication really reduces the chances of spurious findings. You do one study at one university and they find something. You do another study at a totally different university, a totally different set of participants, totally different time of year, time of day, all these different things. You find the same thing. That's much more unlikely that 2 studies found a spurious result. You put a third one in the mix, even more unlikely. This was a problem back in the 80s and 90s when scientists were trying to show that there was scientists and doctors and medical practitioners and public interest groups and politicians were trying to prove there was a link between smoking and cancer. Obviously, the tobacco companies fought as hard as they could to against the data that showed that there was a link between smoking and cancer. And so they would say things like, hey, but if you've done only one study, isn't there a possibility that that's just a spurious correlation? And they'd say, yeah, that's true. So they have to do even more studies. Study after study after study, decades of studies showing that there's a link between smoking and cancer. And finally, there's enough evidence that it's pretty much incontrovertible that there's a link between smoking and cancer. What didn't help was that it's correlative. You can't ethically take 30 babies and make them smokers and 30 babies and never allow them to smoke. It's just not a thing you can do. That would be an actual like experimental condition. And then you could say like, look, we did this. We held everything constant. They had the same diet, lived the same life. They lived in the same parts of the country. The ones that smoked from birth have cancer and the others don't. You can't do that. So we have to do correlative studies. And then, of course, that opens you to the criticism of like, okay, you're saying that these people that were smokers had cancer, but they all live in the city. So couldn't it be that city life is giving them cancer? And if you look into this, there's plenty of documentaries on this on YouTube. I think there's some on Netflix. So if you have, the YouTube ones are free. But the battle to show that there is a link between smoking and cancer, so long. So much research went into it because basically they just had to like back every study up because of the fact that every finding could be spurious. But that's science working. You probably shouldn't have had to go that long. But that is science at work. That's what it does. Every study bolsters another study. And sometimes scientific progress is slow because you just have to do so many studies. But it is self-corrective and, it does allow true findings to rise to the top because studies will build upon them. If you've heard of the replication crisis, this is true in a lot of social psychology studies. It's true everywhere. Social psychology and sociology tend to be two of the biggest areas where the replication crisis is like most out of control. And people say that this shows that there's some people, especially people who either don't understand the process of science or people who purposely are bad-mouthing science, say that this shows that science is broken. That's not true. It actually shows that science is working the way it should. Like I said, science is self-corrective. And so what's going on here is scientists are trying to replicate old studies, or they're trying to extend them in new contexts, and they're saying, hey, this doesn't work. And what the hell's going on? And so they do, another group does the same study. They try to replicate the same one that the first group did. It doesn't replicate for them. So the replication crisis is not a crisis of science. Kind of what it is it's blowing the lid off of bad science that was done in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Starting in the 80s and 90s, there's a lot more people in the scientific communities. It's more people could watch over what was being done. And so it was less likely that a researcher would just like write up a paper, send it off, and say, yeah, I totally found this, when they actually maybe didn't. And so we're just uncovering that now. Again, I don't see it as a crisis so much as it is like we're self-editing. We're finding what is true and what wasn't true from an era when you could kind of just like, just play fast and loose with what was actually there. A lot of those people have since retired, and, it's fine. We just say which studies don't work and which studies do work. So it's not really a crisis. And it's also taught us a lot of things about how to... There's some people who are intentionally publishing things that didn't work. There's some people who are unintentionally changing their data in ways that made it look like their effect was a lot bigger. And now we know how to avoid that. One of the things people did not do back then was publish effect sizes. If you've had a stats class, you know what an effect size is. If you haven't had a stats class, an effect size is basically just another number that goes along with all the numbers at the end of the statistics. And the effect size tells you how big of an effect something is. You can have a p-value, and the p-value doesn't tell you how big of an effect it is. The p-value is absolutely tied to how many people you've tested. If you've tested a lot of people and there's a tiny difference, you have a small p-value because you have a ton of people. but the effect size gets rid of the effect of having, say, like 10,000 people in your study. So let me ask you this. If we look at aspirin, which is cheap, versus something that's more expensive, they say like 5 times as expensive as aspirin, and we want to see if that works better to alleviate headache pain. I get 10,000 people in each group. I have one group of 10,000 people take aspirin, another group of 10,000 people take this new expensive drug. I find a statistical difference. And so then I say you should take this expensive drug because there's statistically a difference here. But what's the effect? What's the size of the effect? Well, because I have 10,000 people in each group, it could be like the most minuscule difference, but the average, right? The average doesn't change. Each individual thing could, but the average doesn't. And so if the averages are different enough, I'll get a statistical effect, even though there might be like really not that much of a difference between aspirin and the other one. Is it worth shelling out 5 times as much for this new one when it only reduces your pain by like 1% more than aspirin? No. So it would show an effect that's super small. Likewise, maybe I only grab 3 people, or 30, not 3, 30 people. 30 people take aspirin, 30 people take the new thing. There's a huge difference, but I've only got 30 people, and the p-value comes out to be like just barely in the significant area, like 0.48. And the effect size shows that there's an enormous difference, 20% difference in pain reduction. Well, so the p-value being kind of close to 0.05 is because I only have 30 people in each group. But the effect size shows that there's a huge difference. Now, in the early days of doing social science research, people were not publishing effect sizes. And so a lot of this replication crisis comes from the fact that they were reporting things that had statistically no effect. The statistics showed that the p-value was significant, but the effect size was so small that it may not have showed that there was an effect at all. So they published this because they weren't even looking at effect size. All they were looking at was p-value. Publish it 30, 40, 50 years later. People are doing research. They're using, now we use effect sizes. You have to publish effect sizes when you publish. And now we see that, oh, my p-value shows that there's a difference, but I've got 100 people in the study. The effect size is minuscule. So it's not an effect. And that's one of the things we're figuring out. We're also figuring out that occasionally there are people who lied about their data. You can't really get rid of that, but you can self-correct it. And science, again, is self-corrective because of replication. Okay, we've pretty much talked about the probability value now, and you've learned about it already in the other videos. But p-value means probability value. That's all it means. In most cases, what that means is the probability that all groups came from the same population. That's really what the p-value means. It's like what's the likelihood that everybody we're testing, both groups that we're looking at, or all 3 groups that we're looking at, or whatever, came from the same population. If the p-value is really low, it's really unlikely that all the people came from the same population, which means there's 2 different groups of people. That's what we're looking for. We're saying there's a difference. There's a statistical difference. Going on the same example, if a ton of people took the aspirin and a ton of people took my new pain drug and it works really well, we've created 2 new groups. We've created a group of people with a little bit of pain alleviation. We've created a group of people with a lot of pain alleviation. So 1 population and 2 populations. So we want a low p-value because it's the probability that everyone came from the same population. But I've created 2 populations. Population who took one drug, population who took another. So low p-value shows that it's unlikely they came from the same group. That's really what that means. It's pretty simple when you think about it in that way. Again, there's variation in every score, but not in the average. So we have an average for each group, and we're really comparing the averages. So here's one population. This is everybody before they take the headache medicine. They're all in the same group. After they take the headache medicine, I've created two groups. The blue group has taken aspirin, the red group has taken the new pill. And now they're in two groups. And so the p-value, when I do a t-test on these, I'll get a p-value. The p-value is low, 0.002. And that means that there's 0.002% chance that the people that I grabbed from this and measured and the people that grabbed from this and measured came from the same population. There's two different populations here. So, unlikely that they came from the same population. If we measured them prior to getting the drug, we'd have a high p-value because they are coming from just one population. People who have bad headaches and would like a drug to get rid of that headache. That's what the p-value means. To put this into perspective of other things we've talked about in the class, when we're looking at testing different causes of ASD, when something causes a medical change, it creates a new population. If vaccines were related to ASD, what you would have is an unexposed group and an exposed group. Unexposed group would have a certain rate of ASD, and the exposed group would have a different rate of ASD. Now, if there's not an association between vaccines and ASD, there's still just one population. Because there's no change. If there's not an association, you just get this one default population of people. And so then you test them, and you get a p-value. And studies have done this. A lot of studies have done this. After Andrew Wakefield's original falsified data, all the way up to pretty recently, I think the last look into this came out around 2020, something like that. Somebody looked into the area again. What they do is they look at rates of ASD in groups who have got vaccines, rates of ASD in groups of people who do not have vaccines for health reasons or choice reasons. And what they find is there is statistically no difference in the rates of ASD. You can have someone who has experience, and they'll say like, hey, I took my kid in, we got this thing, and then they got this diagnosis. Well, that doesn't mean that it caused it. And in fact, if you look at the data, there's no difference in the rates of diagnoses from one population to the other, because there's just one population. It's just kids. So this is how we use statistics, p-values, to test all sorts of things. Headache medicine, blood oxygen level dependent measures for emotional passages versus math passages, all sorts of things. All right. That is all the extra information I wanted to give you.